At 1 a.m. in New York, as I sat alone in the glass tower of Meridian Analytics on my first day, my parents stormed into the office without warning, shouting that I was nothing but a mistake, that my brother was the only pride of the family. And as the room filled with stunned colleagues and a security chief stepping in, I, Marissa Hale, realized my very worth was about to be judged in front of everyone. It was 1 in the morning in New York, and I was still at my desk on the 19th floor of the glass tower that housed Meridian Analytics. The office was nearly silent, except for the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the constant tap of my keyboard. A cleaning cart squeaked down the hallway once, and then faded away. I was alone again with the glow of my monitor and the unfinished report that marked my first official assignment. I leaned back in my chair, rubbed my neck, and glanced at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline shimmered 1,000 little fires against the dark sky, and I whispered to myself that this was what I had been working for all these years. Tonight was supposed to be the first step out of the shadow of my family. My phone lit up on the desk. Mom. For the first time all night, my heart lifted. Maybe she had stayed awake to tell me she was proud. I grabbed it quickly and lowered my voice to a hush, as if the empty office might overhear me. I told her I was still working, finishing a report to make a good impression. There was a pause long enough for my smile to fade. Then her voice came through cool and edged. You think this job proves anything? They probably brought you in to check a box, not because you belong. The words hit me like cold rain down my back. I straightened in my chair, pressing my palm against the desk to steady myself. I tried to swallow the sting to keep my voice calm, but before I could answer, my father's voice carried from somewhere close to her, louder and harder. Your brother Daniel is the one with real potential. He knows how to handle people. You bury yourself in books and think that makes you special. My chest tightened, heat rising into my face. I wanted to tell him that Daniel had never held a steady job, that every chance he got was handed to him while I had clawed my way here with scholarships and long nights. But the words stuck in my throat. My mother spoke again, softer this time, but no kinder. You should not fool yourself into thinking this company will keep you. One mistake, and you will be right back where you started. I pressed my lips together so tightly they trembled. My hand shook around the phone, and I set it flat on the desk to keep from dropping it. The cursor on the screen blinked in and out, reminding me that the report was still unfinished, that my chance to prove myself was slipping while their voices chipped away at me. I whispered that I had to get back to work and ended the call. The screen went black, leaving only my reflection staring back, pale and tight-jawed. The echo of their words lingered in the sterile office air. I pushed the phone aside and leaned forward, forcing myself to type, but my fingers felt heavy. The pride that had carried me through the night had drained away, replaced by the familiar weight of doubt. I rubbed my temples, tried to focus on the numbers, but my father's voice rang in my head, sharp and certain. Daniel is the one with real potential. The lights above hummed louder in the silence. I stood and paced to the window, pressing my forehead lightly against the cool glass. The city below sparkled with promise, but I felt as if I were standing outside of it, unseen and unwanted. My reflection in the glass looked like a ghost. I whispered to myself that I would finish the report, that I would not let them be right. I forced a breath, returned to my desk, and reached for the keyboard again. But the sound of my pulse drowned out the tapping of my keys. The office felt colder than before, every shadow sharper. I looked once more at my phone, dark on the desk, and thought about the voices that had just filled my ear. They had followed me my whole life, and now they had found their way even into this tower that was supposed to be my escape. Outside, the lights of the city flickered, like they were daring me to prove them wrong. I clenched my fists, sat down, and told myself I would. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning and the night was far from over. I could still hear my father's voice echoing in my head, not from tonight's call, but from years earlier, when I was 12, standing in our kitchen in Albany with my report card in hand. I had brought home straight A's, a perfect line of letters that glowed with possibility, and I had placed it on the counter in front of him. He barely looked before asking if Daniel had finished his baseball practice. My triumph vanished in the silence, and I remember staring at the tiled floor wishing I had been born someone else. Daniel was 4 years older, and to my parents he could do no wrong. He was charming in the way that filled a room quick with jokes and careless with responsibility. When he crashed our neighbor's car during high school, my mother smoothed his hair and whispered that boys would be boys. When I asked for help with college applications, she waved me off and said I always figured things out on my own. I did figure it out, but the loneliness of carrying my own dreams without a witness never left me. By the time I earned a full scholarship to Cornell, Daniel had already dropped out of community college. My parents never told our relatives that part. At family gatherings, they spoke of his potential, his big ideas, how one day he would surprise us all. At my graduation in 2017, I stood in my cap and gown in the crowded auditorium. I searched the rows for their faces and saw only empty chairs. Later that night at a family dinner, I insisted we have my father lifted his glass and chuckled in front of everyone that daughters were better at making coffee than building careers. The laughter that followed burned through me more than any slap could. I smiled to hide the sting, but inside I made a promise to myself. I promised that one day I would have something so solid, so undeniable, that no one could laugh it away. Every late night in the library, every hour, I worked 2 part-time jobs to cover what scholarships did not. I repeated that promise. Daniel moved from job to job, a sales role here, a startup there, each ending the same. He told people he had not been given the right chance yet, and my parents nodded along. They never admitted the rumors that followed him, the whispers of missing funds or questionable choices. To them, his failures were temporary storms, while my accomplishments were accidents of luck. When I landed my first position in data research, they told me not to get comfortable that women in tech were often pushed aside. When I received my promotion 2 years later, they asked if I planned to settle down and give them grandchildren. Every word carried the same weight, a reminder that no matter what I built, it would never be enough against the shining illusion of Daniel. Even tonight, in the heart of Manhattan, miles away from the house where those words had been spoken, the weight pressed down on me. I could see Daniel's grin, the way he carried himself at family parties, drink in hand, charming the room, while I hovered near the edge. He was always the star in their story, and I was always the supporting character they barely mentioned. I sat at my desk in the quiet office and pressed my palms together. I told myself that the report in front of me mattered, that every number and chart was proof I belonged. But the shadow of Daniel was still there, stretching long and heavy. I wondered how far my parents would go to protect that illusion, and a chill ran through me at the thought that their words tonight might only be the beginning of something far worse. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made me freeze. At that hour, no one should have been there. I lifted my head expecting maybe a cleaner or a guard, and instead, my stomach dropped. My parents were standing in the doorway of the Meridian Analytics office as if they belonged there. My mother, Patricia, scanned the empty desks with a smirk tugging at her mouth. "So this is what you call success." My father. Robert clicked his tongue, his eyes sweeping over the rows of monitors left in sleep mode. "Working like a servant for a paycheck that barely pays the rent." I pushed back my chair and stood, my voice tighter than I intended. "What are you doing here? You cannot just walk in like this." They exchanged a glance that looked almost like amusement. Patricia stepped further inside her heels, striking the polished floor with slow, deliberate taps. She picked up the draft of my report from my desk, turned a page, and let it fall back with a sharp slap. "Daniel should be sitting here, not you." Heat flushed through me, but I forced my arms to remain at my sides. The words were too familiar, the comparison too old. I clenched my jaw and told myself not to give them the reaction they wanted. Behind me, a soft voice broke the tension. "Marissa, are you all right?" I turned and saw Lydia, a junior analyst from another team, still in the office with her laptop under her arm. Her wide eyes flicked from me to my parents, unsure of what she had walked into. I opened my mouth to explain, but Robert cut across me, his voice loud enough to echo against the windows. She spends all night chasing numbers that mean nothing, wasting her life. If Daniel had this office, people would notice him. Lydia shifted uncomfortably, hugging her laptop closer. I wanted to disappear. My pulse hammered in my ears, and for a moment I could not find words. Patricia tossed my report back onto the desk, the papers sliding across the polished surface. Look at this. Do you really think this company takes her seriously? I stepped forward, grabbed the pages, and stacked them with shaking hands. Please leave, I whispered, but my voice cracked. Robert leaned on the edge of my desk, looming his eyes sharp with contempt. We raised you to be stronger than this, yet here you are hiding in an office at 1 a.m, like some intern desperate to be noticed. Every muscle in my body screamed to shout back to defend myself, but the weight of their presence pinned me. Lydia hovered in the doorway, frozen between stepping in and retreating. I caught the pity in her eyes, and hated that she saw me like this. I swallowed hard and forced my voice steady. You should not be here. You need to leave before someone else sees. Patricia laughed low and cutting. Afraid your colleagues might realize who you really are. Her words sliced deeper than I wanted to admit. The air in the office felt suddenly too thin, the lights too bright. I pressed my palms flat on the desk, grounding myself, and tried to remember that this place was supposed to be my escape, my sanctuary. Instead, they had followed me here, dragging Daniel's shadow right back into the heart of my new beginning. Lydia shifted again, clearing her throat nervously. She seemed ready to intervene, but I caught her eye and shook my head just enough to stop her. I was not sure if I wanted help or if I simply could not bear to have anyone else witness more of my humiliation. The silence stretched heavy and sharp, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. My parents stood as if they owned the room, daring me to push back, daring me to prove them wrong. I realized then that this confrontation was only starting, and the night was about to spiral into something even more public and far harder to contain. Voices began to rise, bouncing off the glass walls and carrying down the empty corridor. I heard the shuffle of footsteps and turned to see 2 employees from another floor stop at the doorway. Curiosity painted on their faces. Before I could say anything, my father jabbed his finger toward me, his voice sharp enough to slice the quiet. This company is being fooled. She is nothing, just a token to make their numbers look good. My stomach clenched. I wanted to protest, to deny it, but my mother's words cut in colder than the office air. We know she will not last here. She never lasts anywhere. A knot formed in my throat. My hands gripped the edge of the desk so hard that my knuckles whitened. I could feel the heat of all those eyes on me, not mocking, not supportive, just stunned, as if they were witnessing something too private to watch, but too shocking to ignore. Then, Dana Morris, the HR manager, appeared. She carried herself with calm authority, her heels clicking steadily as she entered the room. Her gaze moved from my parents to me, then back again. I heard her voice low and controlled. This is a workplace. You need to lower your voices right now. My father barked a laugh and shook his head. We have every right to speak the truth about our own daughter. Patricia folded her arms, her chin tilted high, her eyes gleaming with self-righteousness. If her colleagues knew who she really was, they would never trust her. My cheeks burned, but no sound came from my mouth. My chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, and I prayed silently for the floor to open beneath me. Dana did not flinch. She positioned herself between my parents and me, her tone firmer. This is not the place for this conversation. If you have concerns, you can schedule a meeting in the morning. But right now, you are disrupting employees who are here to work. More heads peeked in from the hallway. I recognized a systems analyst from the 15th floor and an intern from my own team. Their eyes darted between me and my parents, unsure of what to do. The humiliation thickened in my throat until I could hardly breathe. My father's hand slammed down on my desk, rattling the keyboard and scattering a few loose papers. You should all know, he shouted, she does not belong here. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Dana's jaw tightened and her eyes hardened. Mr. and Mrs. Harris, I am warning you, if this continues, I will have to call security. Patricia's lips curled in disdain, and she gestured toward me, afraid that people will finally see her for what she is. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to shut out the room, the voices, the stares. My lungs burned. When I opened them again, I caught Lydia's face just beyond the crowd, pale and worried. She looked like she wanted to step in but did not dare. I wished she had not seen any of it. I wished none of them had. But it was too late. My parents had dragged the shadows of my childhood right into the center of my new beginning, and everyone was watching. The air grew tighter, like the room itself was closing in, and I knew this was not going to end with words alone. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the heavy tread of boots approaching, and my pulse quickened with dread at what was about to unfold next. A tall man in a dark uniform entered the room with steady steps, his badge catching the glare of the overhead lights. His presence shifted the air instantly, the murmurs in the hallway fading as people pulled back. He introduced himself as Victor Ramirez, head of security for Meridian Analytics, his tone clipped and professional. "This is private property. You are disrupting employees. I need you to leave now." My father squared his shoulders and barked back, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I am her father. I have every right to teach my daughter a lesson wherever I find her." My stomach twisted. I wanted to sink into the floor. Victor did not move, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes calm but firm. "Sir, that is not how this works. You are not permitted here without authorization. If you continue, I will have to remove you." My mother stepped forward, her heels striking sharply against the tile. She slammed her palm on my desk, rattling the monitor. "This girl does not belong here. She is not qualified, and everyone should know it." The sting of her words made my chest ache. I gripped the edge of my chair, willing my hands not to shake. Around us, more employees gathered, their faces pale and anxious, some whispering, some recording with their phones. I wanted to scream for them to stop watching, but the words caught in my throat. Victor raised his voice just enough to cut through the chaos. "Ma'am, if you do not step back, I will file a report and involve the police for trespassing and harassment." The room went silent for a moment. My father's jaw worked furiously, and his fists clenched at his sides. My mother's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. I thought just for a moment they might finally back down. Then my father leaned toward Victor, his voice dropping into a growl. "Call whoever you want. We are not leaving until her boss hears what kind of fraud she is." A nervous laugh rippled through the gathered employees, not out of humor, but disbelief. My face burned. I wanted to tell them all the truth, that I had earned every step here, that nothing had been handed to me. But before I could speak, the door at the far end of the office opened again. The sound of polished shoes on tile cut through the tension, steady and deliberate. Every head turned as Harold Green, the vice president of operations, stepped into view. His tailored suit caught the light, and the authority in his posture commanded silence before he said a word. He glanced at me briefly, then at the crowd, and finally at my parents, who stood defiant in the center of the room. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The chaos ebbed, replaced by a taut expectancy. I felt my breath catch in my chest, because whatever was about to happen next would change everything, and there was no way to stop it now. Harold Green's eyes swept across the room, and when they landed on my parents, his expression hardened. His voice carried the weight of authority and cut through the silence like glass breaking. "I remember your son, Daniel Harris. He worked here 3 years ago. He was terminated for embezzling $50,000 from a client account." My head snapped up, my mouth dry. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. The floor tilted under me, and the crowd of employees seemed to blur at the edges. My father's shoulders stiffened, his gaze dropping to the carpet. My mother's hands trembled against her folded arms, though she tried to hold her chin high. Whispers rippled through the employees standing in the doorway. The words embezzling and terminated floated like smoke through the room. I felt every pair of eyes swing away from suspicion of me and settle with judgment on them. I stared at Harold, waiting for him to take it back, to say he was mistaken, but he went on without hesitation. "This company does not forget losses like that. And yet here you stand, trying to disgrace the daughter who has earned her place here with hard work and integrity." Heat rushed into my chest, not from shame this time, but from something like vindication. The humiliation that had suffocated me minutes earlier loosened, replaced by a spark I had been waiting for my whole life. My parents had built Daniel into a monument and buried me beneath it. Now the cracks in their monument were laid bare in front of everyone. I glanced at Lydia. She was staring wide-eyed, a hand pressed to her lips. Dana, the HR manager, gave a sharp nod, as if she had known pieces of this truth, but never dared to voice them. The crowd murmured, louder phones slipping lower as people forgot to record, and simply watched. My father finally raised his head, his face blotched with red. "That was years ago. It has nothing to do with tonight." Harold's gaze did not soften. "It has everything to do with tonight. You barged into my office in the middle of the night, harassing my employee, claiming she was unworthy, when in fact your family has already cost this company dearly." My mother's voice cracked as she tried to recover control. "Daniel is talented. He just needed the right opportunity." No one responded. The silence that followed her words was heavier than shouting. She faltered, her eyes darting to the employees who avoided her gaze. I realized I was breathing harder, my hands no longer gripping the desk for balance. For the first time that night, I did not feel small. My father had always told me Daniel was the one with real potential, that I should not pretend to be more than I was. But here in this brightly lit office, his lie unraveled in front of strangers who finally saw me without his filter. Harold took a step closer, his voice firm. "Marissa was hired for her skills and results. She belongs here. The only disgrace in this room is the way you have treated your own daughter." The words struck like a gavel, final and undeniable. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. My father clenched his fists once more, but his defiance had drained away. I stood straighter, meeting the eyes of my colleagues. For once, I did not feel the need to explain or defend myself. The truth had spoken louder than I ever could. The office was silent except for the hum of the lights. Then, the muffled buzz of a phone vibrated in someone's pocket, startling us all back into motion. I knew this moment was not the end. It was a turning point, and the fallout was only beginning to unfold. Victor Ramirez moved with quiet authority, stepping between my parents and the stunned group of employees. His hand gestured firmly toward the door. "It is time for you to leave." My father glared but did not speak. My mother hesitated. Her chin lifted as if sheer will could reclaim dignity. When she finally turned, she snapped her eyes back at me. "Daniel will always be better than you." The words hit me, but for once they did not pierce. The silence that followed was thicker than steel. No one in the office echoed her. No one defended them. Their voices, once so powerful in my life, dissolved into nothing against the weight of that silence. Victor escorted them toward the hall. My father's shoulders slumped in defeat. My mother's steps clipped and uneven. The crowd of employees parted, and I caught the way some avoided their eyes, others shook their heads. For years, I had been the one shrinking under judgment. Tonight, it was them. I felt my body trembling, adrenaline rushing out in waves. My knees weakened, and I steadied myself against the desk. Dana Morris crossed the room and rested a steady hand on my shoulder. Her voice was low, but unwavering. "We believe in you." I looked up at her, and for the first time in hours, my throat loosened. Lydia appeared just behind, her eyes shining, and gave a small nod. She did not need to speak. That look was enough to tell me I was not alone. Then Harold Green stepped forward, filling the space my parents had vacated. His presence was commanding, his suit crisp, his face solemn. He turned to the gathered employees, many of whom still lingered in the doorway, their phones in hand. "Here is what you should understand. This woman has earned her place at Meridian Analytics. No one, not even her family, has the right to take that away." The words struck me harder than my mother's insult. My breath caught tears pressing behind my eyes. All my life, I had been waiting for someone with authority, someone whose words carried weight, to stand up and say I mattered. And it happened in the very office my parents tried to use against me. There was a ripple of agreement, soft murmurs, people nodding. The energy in the room shifted, tilting toward me instead of away. I stood straighter, even as my hands shook. For once, I was not shrinking. Harold faced me directly. "You are valuable here. You belong here." I could not answer, not yet. My voice would have broken. Instead, I gave a small nod, my chest tight, the mix of shame and relief overwhelming. Behind us, the glass door closed with a final click as Victor guided my parents out of sight. The echo lingered like punctuation marking the end of their intrusion. But deep inside, I knew it was not finished. My family would not simply disappear into silence. Their pride had been wounded in front of strangers, and they would not forgive easily. Still, for that moment, in that fluorescent-lit office with colleagues watching, I felt the rare weight of being defended. The shadow of Daniel did not vanish, but it lifted just enough for me to see the path ahead. And in that fragile space between humiliation and vindication, I realized the real test was still waiting beyond those doors. The next morning, the sunlight spilling through the glass tower felt different, sharper, as if the city itself had witnessed the night before. When I walked back into the office, Dana from HR was already waiting. She carried a folder tucked under her arm and asked me to sit down. Her voice was calm but firm, as she explained that an incident report had been filed. Security footage and multiple employee statements would be attached. My parents' names were listed under trespassing and harassment, and if they attempted to come back without permission, the police would be notified immediately. I nodded slowly, absorbing each word. For the first time, I realized their power over me ended at the doors of this building. They could not bully their way through corporate policy or hide behind the excuse of being my parents. By mid-morning, the whispers in the hallways had changed tone. Colleagues I barely knew sent quick messages to my inbox. Small notes of support that said things like, "Keep your head high," and "You did nothing wrong." Lydia came by my desk with coffee, sliding the cup toward me without a word, but giving me a look that said she understood. The humiliation of last night still clung to me, but it was layered now with something warmer, something that felt like belonging. Around noon, Harold called me into his office. He stood behind his desk, the skyline stretching wide behind him. "You handled yourself with more composure than many seasoned employees could," he said. "Do not let last night shake your confidence. We value your skills here, and I see potential for you to move further in this company." My throat tightened at his words, but I managed to thank you. Walking out of his office, I felt taller, as if the weight of Daniel's shadow had thinned just a little more. Later that day, I learned that HR had contacted outside investigators regarding my brother's past misconduct. Files that my parents had kept buried were being revisited, and the story of his embezzlement at Meridian was resurfacing. Within hours, I heard through a friend in the industry that no firm would touch his resume again. His reputation, once polished by my parents' endless excuses, was unraveling fast. I sat at my desk staring at the reflection of myself in the black screen of my monitor. For years I had believed their voices believed that I would always be less, always be invisible compared to Daniel. But the truth had come into the light, not because I screamed for it, but because the facts stood on their own. For once, the burden was not on me to defend myself. The office buzzed around me with ordinary noise keyboards, clattering phones, ringing conversations about deadlines and projects. Life went on. But inside, I felt a shift that was anything but ordinary. The fear that had followed me from childhood into adulthood began to loosen its grip. That evening, when the floor had cleared and the sun dipped behind the skyscrapers, I lingered at my desk. I thought of every family dinner where I had been silenced, every gathering where Daniel was lifted up while I was ignored. I thought of the years of working twice as hard for half the acknowledgement. And then I thought of last night, standing in that same office, my parents shouting, while my colleagues looked on, and Harold's voice cutting through it all to declare that I belonged. I whispered into the empty room, more to myself than anyone else, that I was no longer the shadow. I was no longer the forgotten daughter. My name was mine now, not an afterthought beside Daniel's. If you have ever been dismissed, if you have ever been told that you are not enough, I want you to remember this. Your value is not defined by the people who refuse to see it. Your worth is not measured by the shadows you are forced to stand in. It is written in your persistence, your courage, and the truth that no one can bury forever. So tell me, if you were in my place, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have stood up to the people who tried to erase you?